All right, everybody, buckle up. Today, we're diving headfirst into a real historical mystery. We're talking about the Muratorian Fragment.
And it's a fascinating one. Talk about a blast from the past. This thing gives us a peek into the early days of Christianity, like right when things were being written down and debated.
No kidding. We're talking about figuring out what actually belonged in the Bible, right?
You got it.
So what is this Muratorian Fragment? Why should we even care about a dusty old document from almost 2,000 years ago?
Imagine, right, it's sometime between the 2nd and 3rd century. Christianity is just starting to spread, and there's no official Bible yet.
Right. Things were a little more, shall we say, flexible back then.
Exactly. So this fragment pops up, discovered way later in the 18th century. It's basically like a list, like an early attempt at saying, these are the books we accept and these ones, well, not so much.
Like a first draft of the New Testament table of contents.
You can say that. It's a snapshot of a really critical moment when they were figuring out what it meant to be a Christian and what their sacred texts were.
That's wild. So why is this fragment so crucial for understanding early Christianity?
It's all about timing. It's like getting a sneak peek into the discussions and arguments they were having just decades after the Gospels were written. It wasn't some after-the-fact interpretation. This was happening in real time.
This is already blowing my mind, and we're just getting started. Stick with us as we break down this Muratorian fragment and uncover the secrets of how the Bible came to be. All right, so we've got this ancient document, basically a rough draft of the New Testament. What kind of stuff do they actually include in this Muratorian fragment?
Well, it's not just a list of books, thankfully. They actually give us some interesting commentary, even little mini bios of some of the authors and their works.
Oh, like a who's who of the early church.
Kind of. Take Luke's gospel, for example. The fragment backs up his authorship, even points out that he was a physician.
Mhm.
It's a bit of weight to his words.
Yeah, like, hey, this guy knows what he's talking about, literally. So they're vouching for him.
Yeah.
What else?
They even get into the nitty-gritty of the text itself. They mention that whole iconic scene at the beginning of Luke with the angel Gabriel appearing to Mary.
Oh, yeah, hard to forget that one.
Right. Well, the fragment specifically mentions it, saying Luke put it before the start of Mark's gospel, like they're highlighting his unique perspective.
That's really cool. They're basically telling us how they read and understood these texts back then. It's like a window into their world. What about the other Gospels?
They talk about John, too. The fragment says he wrote his gospel after the others, encouraged by his fellow disciples, who basically said, dude, you were there with Jesus from the beginning. You got to write this down.
Huh. Sounds about right.
Apparently, they even fasted for 3 days, waiting for a sign from God to confirm that John was the right guy to write it.
Talk about dedication. It makes you realize how seriously they took all this. Okay, but what about the rest of the New Testament? Like Paul's letters, for instance.
They're in there. The fragment lists them out and emphasizes how important they were for the early Christians, showing us that they were already seen as foundational texts.
Makes sense. And what about Revelation? That book's a bit of a wild ride.
Oh, absolutely. It's interesting because the fragment confirms that the revelation of John, the one we know, was accepted. But, and there's always a but.
Hit me with it.
They also mention another revelation, this one by Peter, which they say, and I quote, some of our people don't want read in church.
Oh, snap. So even back then, they couldn't agree on everything.
Exactly. And that's what makes this Muratorian fragment so fascinating. It's not just a straightforward list. It's a glimpse into this dynamic process of figuring out what they believed and which texts were truly authoritative.
So we've got these early Christians, right, sifting through all these scrolls and letters, trying to decide what makes the cut for the official book list. Were there any close calls, any books that almost made it into the New Testament but got left on the cutting room floor?
Oh, absolutely. The fragment actually calls out one in particular, the Shepherd of Hermas.
The Shepherd of Hermas. Okay, that rings a bell, but I'd be lying if I said I knew what it was about. Refresh my memory. What's the deal with this book?
Well, imagine a book full of these wild visions, talking towers, a dragon with sheep horns. It's basically like an early Christian fantasy epic.
Whoa, hold on. They seriously considered putting that in the Bible.
It was actually a pretty popular book for a while there. But the fragment tells us that some folks weren't so keen on it.
Yeah, I can see how a dragon with sheep horns might not fly in every church.
Right. They eventually decided it wasn't really suitable for official readings.
So, too out there for the Bible. Huh, too bad. Sounds kind of interesting, actually. But what about the flip side? What about those texts they absolutely rejected?
Well, the fragment doesn't give us a complete list, unfortunately, but it does drop this great line. It says, Mixing gall with honey is not suitable.
Okay, that's just good writing. What's the context there?
It's basically ancient shade. They're talking about what they called heretical writings. Basically, any text that went against what the early church was starting to define as orthodox belief.
So those groups that got labeled as heretics, people who had different interpretations of Jesus's teachings.
Exactly. The Muratorian Fragment gives us this amazing glimpse into that struggle for authority, that battle over whose interpretation of Christianity would win out.
Wow, this whole conversation has been incredible. It's amazing to think that this dusty old document, the Muratorian Fragment, has survived for almost 2,000 years to give us this window into early Christianity. It's not just a list of books, is it? It's like a snapshot of a really dynamic moment in history.
It really is. It reminds us that the Bible, as we know it, wasn't just handed down from on high. It was the result of centuries of discussion, debate, even arguments about what it meant to be a Christian.
Exactly. They were wrestling with these big questions just like we still are today. What do we believe? What texts are authoritative? It's a process.
And in a way, that process never really ends, does it? I mean, look at how much information we're bombarded with today. How do we decide what's true, what's trustworthy?
Right. It's not like fake news is a new invention.
Not at all. The Muratorian Fragment reminds us to be critical thinkers, to always consider the source and the context, and to be open to having those tough conversations about faith and belief.
Well said. It makes you wonder, what would a Muratorian Fragment look like today? Which books would be up for debate? Which ones would make the cut? Something to think about. This has been a fascinating deep dive, and I hope you'll join us again next time as we explore more mysteries from the past.